So to introduce our first speaker, I want to welcome to the podium Rose Gilhern. Rose is the chair of CAPI's advisory board, and Rose is the person who more than anyone is responsible for the very existence of CAPI, and quite frankly for the reason we're all here today. As former commissioner of DOI, Rose conceived of the idea of CAPI, and she made it happen. She helped provide the initial funding, and she entered into this partnership with the law school here. Rose now works as the Municipal Integrity Principal at Bloomberg Associates, where she consults with cities around the world on municipal integrity and transparency issues. Rose was the Deputy Chief of the Criminal Division of the Southern District of New York, the former chair of the New York City Campaign Finance Board, and the longest-serving commissioner of DOI. Rose still serves on the advisory board of the Urban Law Center of the Fordham University School of Law and is a member of the Government's Ethics Committee of the New York City Bar Association. I feel lazy next to this woman. So thank you, Rose, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Barrett, for those very generous words, and welcome. I'm so glad to see everybody here today, and it's just great to be at another Global Cities Conference, our third one. So good morning. As chair of the advisory board for the Center for the Advancement of Public Integrity, now in its 6th year, which is incredible, welcome, welcome, welcome. And we're thrilled to have all of you in from far and wide, from the anti-corruption community, the scholastic community, civil society, cities, national governments. So thank you so much. I think that you're going to find the program to be a deeply interesting one. We have speakers who approach anti-corruption work from not only different jurisdictions, but from many different approaches and angles. I want to begin by recognizing Berit Berger, who was appointed CAPI's executive director last fall, and she has done a tremendous job convening this extraordinary lineup over the next 2 days for this conference. Hardly a surprise, as she comes having served as an assistant United States attorney in the Eastern District and the Southern District of New York. She was a litigation associate at Paul Weiss, a clerk in the Southern District, and she is a CLS graduate too, so she's just perfectly credentialed for everything that she's doing here. And as she has indicated, she has really immersed herself in the work of CAPI, producing publications, hosting tremendous guest lectures, and incorporating work for law students and undergraduate students through internship opportunities. And that's really exactly what the dean of the law school and I talked about 6.5 years ago when we were conceiving CAPI and all the benefits that it would have to the integrity community and to the law school community, and SEPA and the journalism school and the college as well. So thank you, Barrett, and her predecessor, Jennifer Rogers, the former executive director for the first 5 years, is the person who grew the center, as Barrett indicated. And so thank you, Jennifer, as always, for being here. Public corruption is a target-rich environment, as we know, and one that engenders a high degree of interest and scrutiny. Our first speaker knows quite a bit about that. It is my honor to kick off CAPI's third Global Cities Conference by introducing Huguette Labelle. I first met Huguette in her role as chair of the board of directors of Transparency International, one of the world's leading organizations in the fight against corruption. As TI chair, Huguette focused on the reality that corruption traps millions of people in poverty. She spent her tenure at TI leading the effort to reduce the corrosive effects of corruption to enhance the opportunity for people to have a better life. A companion of the Order of Canada and holder of 13 honorary degrees, Huguette has put her Doctor of Philosophy to use, serving for 19 years as deputy head of several Canadian government departments and more than 20 councils and boards. Among other positions, Ms. Labelle has served as Secretary of State and Chancellor of the University of Ottawa. And recently, in 2016, Prime Minister Trudeau tapped her to head the Independent Advisory Board for Senate Appointments, a fascinating role which she will touch upon today in her remarks. She continues her sterling service as a member and inductee of the Order of Ontario and as a member of the UN Global Compact's board. Huguette is no stranger to Colombia. In 2014, during her tenure as chair of Transparency International, she spoke here about key challenges in the fight against pervasive corruption at the local, national, and global level. So I would like to personally thank her for traveling here from Ottawa to be here with us, and please help me in welcoming Huguette Labelle.
Thank you, Rose. I must admit that I feel like an imposter after hearing what this woman has done with her life, and I'm sure many of you as well in this room, if not all of you. A great heartfelt congratulations and appreciation to CAPI for hosting this third conference. When we look at what's happening in terms of migration to cities, we know how important this is. And according to the UN, and we have some friends from the UN here, about 55% of people now live in cities, and it's expected that in a decade from now, about 68% of people will live in cities. So it's moving, and it's moving in that direction and has been for quite a while. Of course, all of us here and beyond have had experience in dealing with corruption, if not as people who are trying to prevent it, trying to tackle it, or being the victims of it. And in some ways, we are all victims of corruption. And, I'm sure that you are fully aware of the political corruption, bribery, money laundering, state capture, theft by kleptocrats, and we know that it manifests itself, as Rose, as you were saying, with poverty around the world, and a lack of essential services for health, for education, for water, energy, and much more. And of course, it creates a barrier for justice to take place, for regulations to be implemented, and for regulatory institutions to fulfill their responsibilities, either because they're not given the resources, because they could do their job too well, or because they are not, there is steady interference by the elected officials. And what we know is that, of course, corruption is a crime against humanity. And it has many faces. It can be the young woman in a university unable to pay a bribe to get her marks, therefore she fails and is lost to a future that would have been very different, and so is her family. And of course, at the other end of the spectrum, you have those that are caught between those rival leaders fighting for illicit mining or the like, and who get killed in the process, or are left caught between all of them. Rose mentioned to me that maybe I should say a little bit about Transparency International and what our experience has been, and I'd like to do that, but mostly from what I think we have learned. What are the lessons that we have learned over the years, for the last 25 years since its existence? And it's great to have somebody from South Africa, who was involved with Transparency International way back when it first started. So to me, the first lesson is that creating a new organization is possible if you have individuals who are committed, who have great will, and who can mobilize a whole lot of other people. And I think that young people at this university and beyond have the capacity to do this. What happened was way back, Peter Huguette, who was at the World Bank, had seen a lot of corruption because he was a senior officer in Africa and Latin America. He had seen both the bribers and the bribees and the extortionists, and tried to convince his senior leaders in the 80s, 70s to do something about it. And of course, they said, no, this is a sovereign issue, it's too risky, we cannot touch that. So Peter took an early retirement, went back to Germany, and co-opted a lot of his friends. from around the world, former presidents, ministers of justice of Bangladesh, people from this country, Frank Vogel, who had been head of communication at the World Bank, Fritz Hyman, who had been head of legal at GE, and even Robert McNamara, who decided after he left the bank that this was something that he said he should have done and cared about. So basically, he left in 1992, and by 1993, TI was born, with Peter as the chair, Frank as one of the vice chair, and Kamal Hussain from Bangladesh as the other vice chair. So to our young interns and many more, it's possible to do something if you've got the will. My second experience is that beyond creating an organization, which is important, creating a movement is even more important. And what they decided was not to just have an organization headquartered, in this case in Germany, but also to establish national chapters around the world with their own legal personality. And now there are over 100 chapters in 100 countries around the world. And that means that you not only can work at the international level, but you can also work at the national level. And there's also a number of consequences to that. I'm giving you one example, is that one chapter can start something, and the international body shares it with all the other chapters, and a number of them pick it up. And one of them was, for example, back in 2003, where one of the chapters started an advocacy and legal advice center for victims of corruption, for whistleblowers, for witnesses, and helping them through the court, supporting their work, advising them, and eventually also preparing reports so that the organizations that had been at fault could learn from their experience and hopefully do something about it. Other chapters like the TI UK started to work on building integrity and reducing risk in defense establishments. And that took off in a big way. And they became the lead for the whole of the movement in that regard. Et nous avons des gens de la France aujourd'hui qui sont ici. Transparency International France also started to work with Sherpa, a legal organization in France, in order to deal with the bien mal acquis of what has been stolen by a number of countries, with this wealth being in France, either in housing, in apartment buildings, et cetera. And this was with three leaders. It took a long time in order to bring it to some fruition, but right now the vice president of Guinea Equatorial and son of the current president has been condemned to 3 years in jail, fine of 30 million euros, and confiscation of the estimated 150 million euros in France at this time. So, you know, these are some of the examples. But having a movement also makes it possible to mobilize a whole lot of people to try to advocate, whether it is for the G20, for things that they should be doing, meeting next week or is it this week in Japan, the G7, ASEAN, the Open Government Partnership, and so on. So you've got a ready-made institution, and this, of course, meant also that in the 90s, Transparency International worked very hard at supporting the development of the OECD Convention Against Corruption and Bribery. And of course, the United States was at that time the great promoter of that, and had been because of the FCPA of 1977, I think. So this, was obviously different people coming together to make a difference. The same thing happened with the UN Convention, UNCAC, against corruption. My third lesson learned is in relation to keeping the issue high at the international level on one hand, not always making friends, while at the same time being a solutions provider and trying to influence and bringing some suggestions as to what could be done to prevent corruption and deal with it. So what Transparency International has been doing in this regard, of course, some of you might be familiar with the various surveys that we publish, the Corruption Perception Index, which is published in 180 countries, or where 180 countries are ranked. It is perception, but it does get close to reality sometimes. The barometer, which we call the Citizen's Voice, we're asking over 162,000 citizens directly in 119 countries in 2017, for example, if they had to pay a bribe in the previous years, or if their family had to pay a bribe. And this helps to identify in these countries which were the most demanding in terms of bribes, whether it was the police, which is in a number of countries it was. In other cases, it might be the tax collectors, and so on. So these, of course, what I used to get as chair of the board was that the next day, some heads of states would call me and say, your methodology is all wrong. We cannot be that low, of course. But I would also get some calls from other people to say, we know we've got a problem. Can you help? And what we would do is to link them with some of the people in other countries that had done some very interesting work to make changes. What TI also did in this regard, as what I'm calling the solutions provider side, is to do research by extending, bringing a lot of people together, be they academics or others, to deal with specific topics, whether it was the justice system, education, climate change, and published substantive research in this regard. So when TI has spent also a lot of energy on what I was calling being a solutions provider, and this has been through publication of standards, practices, rules, required systems, and their use, of course, by TI chapters and by governments at all levels, because all of these instruments easily apply to all levels of government or to the private sector in all its shape and form. And I will only identify a few tools. One of them was the National Integrity System, which deals with every pillars of society from the government side, from politics to the judiciary to the public service to civil society space and so on. And then approaches in relation to each of these to be able to have greater integrity in the country. Some of the other instruments were, for example, the business principle for countering bribery, which was developed with the private sector, with leaders of the private sector, who then became great promoters of these with their peers. And these still exist today. Enhancing judiciary's ability to curb corruption was also developed in Romania by one of our chapters. Public procurement standards, which were published and improved over the course of the years, with the last edition published in 2014, recognizing how much is lost when procurement does not happen in a transparent and proper way. And of course, with all of these, there was extensive consultation with multi-stakeholders. And in my last years at TI, I felt that the national integrity system was fine. It applied to all levels, but not so specifically to the local government level as it should. And so we developed at that time, in collaboration with cities, with city organizations, national organizations and more, with the academic sector, what we're calling local governance integrity principles and standards, and these were published in 2014. The important part is that tools don't, if they sit on shelves, you spend a lot of energy and then not much happens. So the big issue is always, how do you work with others so that they can become champions in the use of some of these tools so that they have a long life and can be improved over time based on experience. Of course, being a solutions provider meant also working with organizations like the OECD on tax evasion, on mutual exchange of information, with the UN in many fronts, UN Global Compact being one, but not only, and of course with World Bank and other institutions. I think what we've also learned is that if we want a lot of impact, you've got to work with a whole lot of other people, not just your own organization, and that is obvious. And perhaps my last point about TI's experience is on citizenship engagement, citizen engagement. You know, we had spent all of our energy for the first 20 years or so working at the national level, developing through our chapters work at the local level on all aspects of governance. But we were saying, is it really making as much of a difference as it should? Is the trickling down happening or not? And it became obvious that unless you worked at both levels, it would not make the kind of difference that you needed badly over time. Because very often you might have had a government that does tremendous things, but then the next government walks back. And if the citizens are not there to hold them to account, then you might have a lot of regression in what has happened. But working with citizens is easily said, not easily done. And of course, today with the hyperconnectivity, it is much easier, but it's easier to share experience, to promote ideas, and so on. But it doesn't necessarily automatically make the difference. You need more than just using the social media and other forms, obviously. And I'd just like to give you one example of what has happened. Our chapter in Bangladesh is the biggest chapter of all. It's got over 250 staff, and it's just tremendous. One of the things that they have done was to create a youth network. And today they have over 5,000 young people across Bangladesh engaged locally through 60 units of support for these young people. And these are not just young people saying, here are the problems, pushing for something to be done about the problems, but also making suggestions as to what can happen. And here's what this other country has done. Here's what this other part of our country has done in Bangladesh. And it's been very interesting because today, some of the local governments who don't have a unit out of one of these 60 are poaching and are providing some directive to their units to introduce some of the ideas that came out of these other 60 units. So this is a case of going from promotion through media and connectivity of various kinds to being on the ground and doing something about that. They also have a network of other people. It's like a large number of members are part of this group. Let's come to 2019, June, in New York. And I can never fail to remind us, and I hope you will forgive me, about the cost of corruption of at least the most recent data that we have. And the IMF's fiscal monitor of this year is a very interesting, it's a very short document. I encourage you to read it, 2 chapters. Their second chapter is on corruption. And what they indicate was that curbing corruption would deliver an additional $1 trillion in tax revenues alone annually. And the UN 28 report indicates that corruption costs $3.6 trillion annually, depriving people of the services required to be lifted out of poverty. Global Financial Integrity has estimated that illicit financial flows out of developing countries alone are approximately $1 trillion per year. And we always say approximately because it's the tip of the iceberg. a whole lot of stuff is underground that you will never get to. And of course, the Tax Justice Network estimates that corrupt officials have embezzled about 30 trillion over the past 15 years. I'm sorry, yes, 30 trillion. So EU, let me just, maybe a last one. The EU estimates that about euro 120 billion is lost each year in its own member states. And this is just for public contracts. So they've done some pretty good stuff. We've been involved with them in that regard. And knowing that an infrastructure contract, when there is corruption, can cost 50% or so more, or up to 50% more. And at times, of course, this means that the quality of the infrastructure will not be as required, therefore has to be rebuilt a few years later, and that's not just roads, but buildings as well. And it means that, in this case, businesses are victims as well, because some of them are extorted, but others lose contracts that they should have won after spending a lot of money preparing it. So, as we look to the future, the manifestations of corruption obviously remain with us at all levels, whether it's bribery for services and contracts, extortion, money laundering, tax evasion, stealing from treasuries, state capture, as I mentioned earlier. But in the last years, we've seen new drivers of corruption, which I think is important to keep in mind. And one is the shrinking space of civil society and of the media. And with a lot of killing of investigative journalists who are investigating specific cases. And it's not just in one country of the world, it's happening in a number of countries. Commitments to some of the international treaties are being withdrawn, making those treaties weaker than they would otherwise have been and had promised to be. AI and big data becoming both part of the solution, because you can track things more easily, but also facilitator of all types of corruption. And I'm so glad that this conference will have cybercrime as one of its topic because of its rapid evolution. So much has been accomplished, but much more is needed. And to deal, if we're going to deal with the prevailing issues. There's a tremendous wealth of expertise around the world, in this room and beyond, and I think we need to make sure that we pool on that. And I would all like to mention a few areas that I would not feel good if I didn't mention them. And that is that the rule of law remains the top priority. And that's not because we're in the Faculty of Law at Columbia University, which is great, but because that's where it starts. And if we don't have that, we don't have a lot of the other things. So, rule of law, number one, let's protect it. Let's build it if it's not there. The other part has been enforcement. Many countries have developed laws, regulations, and they think that, that's it, all done, now we turn to the next topic. And enforcement doesn't happen, or it's lagging, or the resources to make it work do not happen. So, again, enforcement, we've got to work together on that. And building transparency and accountability in all public institutions, whether it's procurement, finance, land management. We keep forgetting sometimes when we live in countries like the United States or Canada or Europe that land management is not such a big issue, although it could be for climate change or for a number of other things. But in many countries, it is a big issue. And people who have been living on land, the blanket is pulled from under them, and new zoning happens, and they get hardly anything for the properties that they have. Something else which I think we can all work together, which is important, is to get businesses to publish what they pay. and that protects them. I always remember one of a large Norway firm being in North Africa and being extorted and saying, if you want this contract, you need to pay. And he answered, of course, we're ready to do that, but we have to publish it as well as your name on it, because my country has a law that says I have to publish what I pay. That was the end of that discussion. So more of that, I think, is important. And the EU has already decided that all its member states were required to have legislation in this regard, not just for natural resources, but for IT as well, and probably expanding as we speak. Dealing with offshore fiscal havens has remained a huge problem. I understand that the UK is now ready to do something about some of its protectorate. Mind you, it's going to take 5 years, but still, I think this is already an important gesture. And the thing to watch, though, is as fiscal havens are being rated and ranked, money will start moving to other places where you didn't have a fiscal haven. So cautious there is most important. I think strengthening fiscal institutions and practices, whether we're talking of tax administration, regulations of banks, I think is vital, or investing in high level of external scrutiny, whether they be anti-corruption commissions, and I think of South Africa here, and Thuli, who was a wonderful protector in South Africa of citizens, or supreme audits or the like. So I think that, and these again may exist, but more on paper than in reality. So what they look like, what they have, their competence, their independence is so important. I'd like to just spend a few minutes on relooking at regulations for those facilitating money laundering and tax evasion, such as accountants, real estate agents, lawyers, and the like. The client-lawyer privilege is a very interesting one, which we have as something in my country, in Canada, but which prevents lawyers from sharing information, even though they may know that something is very wrong with this client. But because of the client-lawyer privilege, they cannot share that information with inspectors, with investigators. And I think that there's a number of countries where that could exist. And that's something I think that needs to be changed. The banking sector is under great headlines at this time, and it's not just Danske Bank. There's much more, and it's not just 2008 either, of what happened at that time, which may be more or less seen as corruption. It was more looking the other way to some extent. But I think that banks have to increase their due diligence, and the regulations for the banking industry have to be looked at very carefully to ensure that these do not become a place to hide money. Because what's been happening very often is a kleptocrat puts a huge amount of money in a bank account somewhere in the world, which then gets divided quickly and spread into 3 or 4 other bank accounts, and on it goes. So that, to me, is vital. And an important measure to deal with money laundering and hiding of stolen assets is to introduce beneficial ownership registries. Not just somewhere in somebody's office, but public. And the UK has been leading on that front. The G20 has been getting a lot of pressure for this to happen in their countries as well. And the Corporate Transparency Act being considered in the US Congress at this time, I think would be a very important step to end anonymous companies used by criminals to put their money in this country. And the same thing could be happening around the world as it is. So what is essential is to have public registries so that people, not just public registries, but public registries of companies, subsidiaries, and of trusts. There's greater pushback on trusts to have public registries, because that's a very interesting way of hiding money. But I think that together we have to continue our efforts to make sure that countries around the world have legislation to introduce public registries. I would just like to say a few words about the Senate before concluding. As Rose suggested, this is a very interesting situation where the current Prime Minister, before he was elected in 2015, indicated that if he were to be elected, that he would make the Senate, the Canadian Senate, independent. As you may know, the Senate in Canada is not an elected Senate by our Constitution. It's like the UK. It's an appointed Senate. And, you know, it was appointed by different prime ministers, would have been appointing different people to the Senate, and sometimes great people, but people who maybe didn't make it at the last elections, or who were the money holders for that political party. And it was very much a mirror of the House of Commons, where there were parties in the Senate. And of course, if the Prime Minister, the House of Commons, and the Senate were of the same denomination, so there was sort of a bit of rubber stamping all the way. If, on the other hand, the House of Commons was of one political party majority and the Senate of a different political party majority, they have a veto on legislation, so it could put a stop and prevent things from moving quite quickly. So in January, after he was elected in October 2015, in January I got a call asking me if I would chair an independent board in order to recommend to him all future appointments to the Senate. And there's a whole process here, which I will spare you, to make sure that we have the widest body of possible appointments, of possible candidates, and we're committees of 5 and 1 board per province and territory, because there are so many seats in each of these. And to this day, we have 48 senators that have been appointed through this process out of 105. And it's been a very interesting one. As I was mentioning earlier, the only negative comment that I've had was that they were too good. So I think we can live with that. We can live with that. Anyway, it's a very interesting experience. Of course, it's a commitment from this Prime Minister, so we would see if there were another Prime Minister elected, whether that person would keep this going forward. But at this time, we've got terrific members that have been appointed in the Senate, and I've been very pleased to have the chance to be part of that and support this. Coming back to this conference, Rose and colleagues from CAPI and members who are in this room, I think this conference provides a unique opportunity to share successes and learn from each other, of course, and better understand the new threats facing our world. And that's why I'm staying for the whole conference, because I want to listen to what people have to say and learn from that. And of course, being on the campus of this world-renowned university is also a reminder of the role that universities are fulfilling in various ways through their faculties, whether it be law, engineering, science, medicine, public or business administration. And I think we need to support universities in those roles. And I think that together we can cut down the vulnerabilities that make it possible for the corrupt to thrive. As we face entrenched corruption practices, and new headwinds, we need to enhance our collective action. In a way, we need to globalize our anti-corruption solidarity. And in this way, we can move forward with a shared responsibility. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. I would be more than happy to take questions, but much more happy to hear suggestions as well. So,
And you can just speak. There's a microphone in front of your seat. If you turn it on, we'll capture it on the recording.
yes,
Not so sure my microphone is working.
it is.
Maybe
I think it is.
I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about the Canadian mining companies and in terms of water pollution and exploiting countries and tied in with corruption. I'm particularly thinking of South and Central America, where there's the job situation and the water pollution. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that whether it is Canada or any other country, it is just very wrong to be not to protect the environment where you work and ensure that the people do not become the victims of contaminated water. And that can happen, and it has been happening around the world, by whether they be from businesses from my own country or other countries. So I think that that's another part which I think that with the Paris Agreement that most countries have agreed to, and with the great emphasis on climate change at this time, and it's not just the IPCC, but the work, the UN and many others, I think that we can make a difference, but we cannot stop. I think that we need to protect the natural environment and ensure that it is not through bribes or other ways or just neglect that our natural resources are exploited without care for the environment. I used to be vice president of IUCN, so I'm the International Union for Conservation of Nature. So it's an area that is very close to my heart. Thank you for raising that.
Huguette, I have a question, which is, has there been any discussion about codifying the independent advisory board in Canada that you're running so that the selection process, the apolitical selection process, which has produced such tremendous results, can live on to the next administration?
At this time, it is not. This was the will of the current Prime Minister and his cabinet and his supporters. If in the election this fall another party is elected, so far the leader of the Conservative Party said that he would repoliticize the Senate, but we don't know. There's been a survey done recently where Canadians were asked, do you believe in an independent Senate or a politicized Senate? 77% said they wanted an independent Senate. 3% said they were ready to support a politicized Senate. But, that, of course, would have to be seen. So it is not codified. But I think that it's a very interesting question because if, this were to continue, then I think codification of it in law or otherwise would be important. Changing the constitution in Canada is very complicated, and it's not done easily, maybe every 100 years or so. So one has to look to other methods in order to deal with that, and I think codification in law would be a very interesting way. But it's not at this time.